Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first Confidentially Speaking webinar of 2024. And boy, do we have an interesting but rather doom-saying webinar to begin with, and that is Confronting the Too Hard Basket, where we explore mediation techniques when dealing with family business succession planning. Quite a mouthful, but really very interesting. As they say, death is an inevitability, but the way you go can make all the difference, especially in family business. So welcome for those of you who have never heard of Confidentially Speaking, or this is your first webinar. Confidentially Speaking is the home of negotiation and commercial mediation. And today we are thrilled to have Jacqui Brauman with us. She is an expert, accredited estate and wills expert, and she is not only that, she's quite an entrepreneur, owns her own business. So the right person to be talking about family business succession planning, although I'm not sure that Jacqui is ready for this. So Jacqui is, she started TBA Law in 2012. It is a law firm that specializes in estate planning, family law, and property. And as well as that, Jacqui is quite the writer. She's written 3 books already, which I think a lot of it has to do with, is important to what we're discussing. It's In Case of Emergency, a practical guide for young families in case of injury or death. Death and Social Media, a guide to digital estate planning. That's a must-have for everybody, I would think. And The Sandwich Generation. So get yourselves a copy of Jacqui's 3 books, which I'm sure will be very interesting, regardless of whether you are ready to be discussing succession planning or estate planning, but it is something important and inevitability. So welcome, Jacqui, to our webinar.
Thank you, Elise. Glad to be here.
Thank you. So as far as family business is concerned, we know we have a vision of the person who starts the business and they sweep the floors and they get everything going and they take the risk and they build up the business and it's going well. And in many cases, either the children join the business or there's a thought that children will join the business. And that's an important kind of business strategy discussion and how that will work. But at the same time, we know that for most businesses, there has to be an exit plan. In fact, it's scary to think of it, but there has to be an exit plan for the business. And that's either when someone decides to retire, which is estate planning, or someone dies within that. So that's business as a whole. But in family business, the dynamic is a lot more confronting, because not only are you thinking of the director, the main shareholder leaving the business, but you're also thinking of family dynamics involved. And boy, do we know a lot about the toxic environments that can occur when families have issues around business, around money, around inheritance, around estate planning. So now I'm throwing this open to you, Jacqui. What on earth do we deal with here when we're dealing with family succession planning in a business?
Wow. What a huge question. What are we dealing with? Well, I want to start, I suppose, with risks.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's the risk that we put all this in the too hard basket and don't do it.
Yeah.
So I've seen people come too late to this discussion. So that's a risk. I've seen people make assumptions for too long that what they think is a family business, because mum and dad are working in it, they think the kids are interested in it, but actually none of the kids are working in the business and none of them want it. Very different situation to where you've already actually got some kids working in it. So, I mean, there's some of the first elements. It's never too early to start thinking about what the succession strategy should be for a family business. And included in family business is family farms as well, because farming is a huge business. And we hear a lot of horror stories around farms too. However, it's potentially put in the too hard basket because people think or hear about the horror stories, when in fact a lot of them are done very successfully.
Great. So are we going to talk about succession? Do you want to mention more the successful transitions? Give me an example of that just before we go on to the next risk.
Yeah, sure. So a successful transition would be, and again, I think coming back to some farmers that I've worked with recently. So they started working with me in their early 60s. So still a little bit away from really wanting to retire. But they were already working with a financial planner as well. So they already had some other things in mind. And we started really talking early about who was going to get what. 2 children out of 5 were farmers and the others weren't. And often the problem with family businesses and family farms is that they're asset rich for business assets and there's very little other assets. So what do you give to the other children? And that's sometimes what people can't get their head around. So the earlier someone starts planning, and potentially with a financial planner early on in the piece, they start putting some assets away that are non-business or non-farm assets, so that there's actually something there, because the business or the farm needs those assets to be viable. And if some of them need to be sold to give some money to the other children, you're going to leave the children who want to continue farming in a situation that's not viable. And so, I mean, even that's coming to another risk. So start planning early. We move assets into different structures. We start doing succession while the farmer dad still wants to farm. So he feels comfortable that the sons are really stepping up. He starts gradually giving more responsibility for certain aspects of the farming, starts transferring some of the entities of the farm while he's still farming as well and still involved. And so we have enough time then for it to be a gradual process of someone stepping up and everyone feeling comfortable about it.
That's excellent. And do you find, I mean, that's a successful transition that's well planned. You start doing it well ahead of a planned exit. So sometimes 10 years, even 20 years before you start thinking, you might not be doing anything. But what happens when you include your farming son in the business and you start giving some of the responsibilities, and then you think, oh, not really good at this, is he? I mean, that's a risk too, isn't it, in the planning stage?
Absolutely, that's right. And I guess that's why looking at the stages of the transition is really important. And that's a risk as well, about moving control before you've worked out whether this person's capable or not. So really, before you start shifting and changing structures and changing who's in control, you do need to actually assess whether this person can be a successor. And so providing opportunities for them to step up in leadership and take responsibility for certain aspects of the business is a perfect test. And then, if that doesn't work over a year or so, then maybe thinking about having the conversation, this person is not a good manager potentially. And so, I mean, the other options are to get in external management, but still have the ownership with certain family members. But all these options can then start being tweaked so that, it's not at the last minute, because, I've also come across these scenarios where the farmer's in their 80s and hasn't done any succession and dies suddenly, and then it's just a mess. So we don't want that situation either.
No, and that's we'll come to talk about how we can try and avoid that, and certainly the family disputes that come with that. What other risks do you have to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, diving deeper then into family dynamics is a risk. So not only the capability of the people you want to be the successor, but then the family dynamics around who has assumptions about who is actually going to get what. And the family members that are not part of the business, their comments are all often things like, I just want things to be fair, but everyone's subjective opinion of what is fair is different. And whenever you're dealing with families and adult children, who are getting into their 40s or 50s themselves, there's always holding on to things from childhood. So the thing is never the thing. So it's never, not never, it's quite often not about what is actually in front of you. It's quite often not the problem. It's more likely going to be that one of them got the push bike for Christmas that the other wanted when they were 7 years old, and there's some kind of resentment from all the way back then. And there's all these little childhood things that sort of niggle in and come into negotiations once they're in their 40s and 50s. And so those dynamics can be really challenging, because you do have to keep people focused on the task at hand.
Yeah, and trying to deal with the psychological issue that Mum took my brother's side when we had an argument, and it's so unfair, and that's sitting with me since I was 8 years old, and I still remember it. Kind of gets in the way of having a logical discussion about finances and planning, right? Great. Yeah. So if we move on from the risk, let's talk about I think it blends a little bit, but what are your top 5 issues that you deal with when we're dealing with family and business and succession planning?
So the top 5 issues, we've just touched on one, which is the psychological stuff. It's the assumptions that people make. It's what is subjective opinions about what is fair. So, I mean, that's a big issue that we need to cut through. And having the ability to have things said that have been unsaid is quite often important. Often it's a matter where people just want to be heard about things. And then we can sort of move on. But if they never get to have a contribution, then we can't. So that's sort of where you start. You start with what are the psychological dynamics that are at play here between these people.
And that's exactly why I think we can start talking. We'll start talking in more depth about mediation, but that's where you can get the independent person who is not necessarily a mediator, but independent to the advisors, to actually listen to the issues faced by all family members, not representing either, but being able to hear them and help them articulate what they feel in a manner that will be heard and might be persuasive. Is that be correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Next issue would be the parent, or whoever the parents running the business currently, would be choosing who the successor is going to be, like actually having in mind how that's going to work. And I've had an example where someone did come to me a couple of years before they died, and we did do this work. But unfortunately, he just wasn't that realistic. He had 3 children, all of which are in the business. And he was just like, we'll give the control to all 3 of them and they'll work it out. And no matter how many times we discussed it, he wouldn't choose who the successor was going to be, who was actually going to be the manager. And it was clear who this person should be to myself and to the children. The children wouldn't step up and say it to their father either, because they just wanted to make him feel okay about it, or whatever the dynamic was there. And that can be a dynamic in families as well, isn't it? Not actually saying what needs to be said, because things go unsaid and they're never talked about. And I'm still dealing with that estate a couple of years after he's passed away, because subsequent to him passing, there has been a family breakdown between 2 of the brothers. One of them's left the business, and they can't work out how to buy him out. So yeah, we've got that problem. So choosing a successor and actually making a decision can sometimes be an issue.
And it's thinking so far ahead, isn't it? Because it's not just, as you said, like at the time you were talking to the father, even if the family had the discussion with the father and said, look, our sister is the person to take over the business here, and we have full trust, that doesn't deal with what happens in 5-8 years' time, when maybe there is that breakdown for some unknown reason that no one could have thought through. And then you're trying to think of, what do we do in the case of a breakdown, which someone who is trying to deal with succession planning might not want to think through, I mean, that is really the too hard basket. How do I deal with fights within a family when I'm gone?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. That's
yeah,
right. And
yeah,
sometimes you can't deal with all the what ifs.
yeah.
But I think the next of the issues is how you transfer control and what structures you put in place so that if there is a breakdown, it's clear who's in control, and then it's clear how that control can play out. Because with that example I used, we didn't have proper shareholder agreements in place ready to go because the father didn't want to think about that step. If we had shareholder agreements in place, we would have a process outlined for a buyout of someone. So it would be clear and you just follow the process. So thinking about how to transfer control in what entity, and having, it's almost like prevention instead of a cure. So you set out how things happen if the worst happens.
Yeah. So as lawyers, we always say, what if the worst happens? We never come in at, well, the best, what happens if the best happens, right? So that's the job of the estate plan. And it's quite confronting to say to people generally, you're going to die, you're going to exit a business, and you've got to plan for your children never speaking to each other at some stage, right? Yeah. So, and maybe, again, I'm plugging the mediation part. Maybe it's easier when you're not the advisor to be having that conversation where there's no real upside for the mediator to be making that, and you don't have someone saying to you, "Oh, but you're trying to make extra money because now you've got to do my shareholder agreement." I don't know if you've ever encountered that.
Absolutely. Or sometimes you're just consciously aware of that yourself because you're like, am I trying to upsell this? You know, do you want fries with that? No.
We'll take the fries and we'll take the milkshake version. I like that. Let's talk about another. So we've talked about that issue. Give me another example of issues.
Yeah.
Please.
And the last two issues are very much more practical. It's sort of, I've talked briefly as well about the fact that the business is often the asset rich entity, and that's where most of the value is. So that's a practical issue about balancing out how to give something to the other children when the viability of the business could be at risk if it's cut up. So that's obviously an issue. And then the final issue is just around thinking about all the tax and financial implications of getting it done, and what order you do things in for tax advantages, and making sure we take advantage of certain tax exemptions for the transfer of assets and things like that. So having the consultants for the family business, particularly the accountant's really important at that point. But if they've engaged a financial planner along the way, having a team that can give the lawyer advice about those things just makes it much smoother.
So in fact, the best position, if you are talking succession planning in business, or I suppose generally, is firstly to get your ducks in a row pretty early, but also to have your team of advisors so that you can start putting things in place at an early stage and not rely wholly on your accountant or financial advisor, but that they work as a team so they can get the best for you. Right. So coming back to dynamics, I mean, we talked about the family dynamics. What about the issues with the customers of the business? Because I mean, I'm thinking about like family business where there might be loyalties over time. Does that play into how you deal with succession planning? Is there any thought about it in the discussion?
Well, given that we're really talking about this in the context of having a mediation as well, I think that doing it that way would give you the chance to talk about those worries that mum and dad may have. Because if you come at it from a purely legal perspective and you don't have these broader conversations with other family members, it's probably not a legal concern, but it is a concern, and the needs of the business are a concern as much as the needs of the family. And the children that are sort of nominated to be the successors may already have other ideas about how they want to do business, and they've never actually even discussed it with mum and dad. And so having those discussions as part of the succession process can be really important, because mum and dad may not want to see things taken a particular direction, or they may know that that would put the viability of the business at risk. And then, of course, nurturing key relationships across. And that's why, again, giving it the right amount of time for this process to happen is really important, because relationships are key in business. And if someone comes in and disrupts some major relationships, then it can be a significant part of the business gone.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's, I like the flow on that you mentioned, is that when you're a lawyer, you're dealing with certain issues. Someone's come to speak to you about estate planning. You're not talking about the viability of the business going forward, business management and strategic planning, and yet that is a very important part of the whole structure and discussion. And I guess let's bring in mediation here. Both of us are mediators. As I say, Confidentially Speaking is the home of commercial mediation, where we try to talk practically and commercially without legal sophistry. Does that make sense? So no, not legal terminology. We're really interested in the commercial and practical consequences of disputes and discussions. And there is a problem when you're dealing with a business that you want to discuss more than just the legal, more than just the accounts, more than just the financial reality. And when you have an advisor, they need to focus on what it is they've been brought in to do. So when we're talking, we have mediation, but what is mediation? So I'm going to throw it over to you, Jacqui, because I'm interviewing you today. Describe for the team who are listening, what is mediation in its best form?
So I like to think about it in terms of, well, what would be a traditional approach versus what mediation actually is. And also for people to bear in mind that it can be difficult for the professional to wear two different hats. And we've sort of spoken previously about how do you navigate that role as a professional if you're coming in to give advice about a certain thing. But mediation would be a very different hat to wear than a, professional service provider hat. So a traditional approach for dispute resolution from a legal perspective is often position-based and potentially destructive to relationships, because a traditional approach would not necessarily even consider the family dynamics or want to bring in other family members, because a traditional legal approach knows that their client is mum and dad, and so they can't, or they may see that they have a conflict of interest to get instructions or to speak to other family members. So then they would get the instructions from the parent, and they'd really make a firm position around what the parent wanted. So they've sort of dug a position in, regardless of whatever anyone else wants, and they're going to work the system and work this succession into this position. Whereas then you think about mediation, it is interest focused. So we don't necessarily create a really firm position. We look at the interests of the parties and we say, well, what do you want to achieve? It's very much more client driven than professional driven. And the client actually, maybe it's harder for them, but they're guided through a process, which is lovely because they're supported to actually think a bit deeper about what they want, instead of the professional telling them what they want and how it should be, because what is important to them is different from what a legal person can see. Because as we've just spoken about, a lawyer doesn't look at the business strategy. So a mediator comes at it from an interest perspective, gives a lot more of the control of the flow of the discussion to the client and the people involved. And so mediation is client driven, and the outcomes are based on what the clients come to, not what the professionals say should happen. Of course, if you've got a mediator who's also got some legal background, they can sort of say, well, that's going to be really hard to achieve. But ultimately it's really about working towards the interests of the parties there, rather than taking a firm position of the parents and just going from a legal perspective, this is what we have to do. And so then you can see, rather than destructive towards a family which is just pushing through an agenda that actually doesn't explore all the dynamics, mediation is much more constructive, because you are exploring what is important to everyone involved and letting people have a say, even if what they say can be disregarded ultimately. Some of the dynamics we've spoken about is just that people need to feel heard. And so mediation can be much more caring to the family dynamics, make sure that relationships aren't destroyed. Strong word. But that can happen when things are pushed through without consultation. So I guess that overall is sort of how mediation approaches it. And the actual process of mediation can obviously look different depending on what the family business needs. It doesn't have to be just one session. And ultimately, really, with something like this, as I've already said, like start early, have these conversations, and realistically, they can potentially be short conversations, can't they? Like 90-minute to half-day conversations over a period. You might have one every 2 months over a 12-month period. Who knows what the family actually needs? But there's flexibility.
Exactly. And I think when we use the word mediation techniques here, we're saying in this case, we might not use a formal mediation hearing that people have come to use, but saying, well, the person involved is not taking instructions from any particular person. Every party has to contribute to their fee, whatever it is, whatever that means, but it means that the mediator is completely independent. The mediator can have individual sessions. So it might be correct that, instead of first bringing everybody together, the mediator goes out and hears each parties and understands where they're coming from. And so that starts getting the conversation going before you even put what the parties want, but it's hearing what they want and hearing and articulating and challenging them. Very much, if someone said something like, I want 100% of the shares in the business because I'm the oldest, you could say, well, that's never happening. So let's talk, you can be frank as a mediator. So let's talk about reality and start getting people ready for the conversation before the main conversations happen. So I think we could use the techniques.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I guess you think about, again, we're thinking about mediation in a more traditional sense with, a dispute that's quite progressed, aren't we, often? But mediation can be used as a facilitated conversation. Yeah. And I think that it lends itself so much to succession planning because you've got so much more flexibility around, what can be said. And as you said, it's independent. So you're not restricted to having to act for the best interests of someone. So everyone's sort of there to put their own interests forward. So
excellent. And so now we're going to throw at these questions. I mean, I could talk to Jacqui all day, but this is your session. So does anyone have any questions that you'd like to ask us? And please feel free to pepper us with questions whenever. But if there are any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A. And we look forward to answering. Well, Jacqui does, I'm sure. If you have questions of me as well. So let's give it a try. Have you had, give us an example of a case where people were just not able to discuss their issues? I'm assuming, given where you work, you'd have heard this, and what it was about it that they felt like they just couldn't talk about it.
So, I've worked with a couple of families where the family dynamic had already sort of broken down. And so that's really hard. The family business is running away and one of the children has already moved interstate and pretty much, doesn't talk to their siblings much anymore and really has some resentment towards the family business potentially, but certainly the siblings. And so when you can't engage a party, that can be really tricky. And then you're managing assumptions about what this person may or may not do, because that person may completely respect the whole plan that's put forward. They may not automatically be wanting to contest what's happened. So, that can be very, very tricky. And then, of course, so that's a situation where someone's estranged. And then where you've got, again, a similar sort of situation that I've spoken about before, where there's a family dynamic where some children who aren't involved in the business are pretty much sitting back, not really saying what they need to say, or not really participating, and just sort of saying, yep, that's fine, mum and dad, yep, I understand, yep, happy to go with what you're suggesting or what the pathway is, but in fact they're not, and they're lying or omitting, because that is the family dynamic, that you don't actually tell mum and dad what your thoughts and feelings are about something. So I mean, those are really tricky situations.
Perfect. I think there's a question in the chat. I'm not sure, says she. Here we've got an anonymous attendee. Assuming no family complexities, what process should a couple undertake to resolve their wills, and how long should they budget?
That's easy. No family complexities. So look, if there's no family complexities, an estate plan can sort of be done over a month, really, with 2 or 3 appointments. It's not, and then it just means whatever structures the business are operating in, just having a closer look at those structures. It might then mean that, there has to be some change to the structures, or change to what owns what asset. So there might be some moving of assets. But I mean, the process of doing wills is not a difficult process. And then because when we're talking about succession, you'd be surprised how little the wills actually cover. Because in family business, there's often self-managed super fund might own some of the real estate that the business is trading on. Then you might have a family trust that owns some of the shares in the family business, or a unit trust. And you've got another company that's running the business itself, and then you might have another trust that owns some other assets that might then lease those assets to the operating entity. And so you've got all these other entities, none of which are covered by the will. And so you need to be looking at the trust deeds and the structure of those businesses, and work out the inbuilt succession that's already there and whether that works. And if it doesn't work, you actually make changes to the entity rules themselves. So I guess that's the legal complexities of it. But you don't have to worry about the legal complexities. That's what the lawyer's for.
But it is interesting, isn't it? Because people think the will sorts it out, but if you're in a business, most of the time, the reality is that unless it's a sole proprietorship or a partnership, everything about the business is not sitting with the will, although the will is part of what you have to deal with. I mean, I'm not going to mention the name, but I do know one billionaire who died. I think he had $100,000 in assets for himself. Everything was tied up in family trust. So the will was almost meaningless. But good question, anonymous speaker. So let's talk about, you talk about the dynamics, but what there's a contesting of the will. But if you've already set up estate planning, as you've discussed, the trust and that, what is open to a family member who, well, firstly, let's say it's in the will, it's a partnership and there's an issue there, or it's actually something to do with the trust deeds and the beneficiaries involved. How does that play out, and when would I, as the family member, start contesting these things?
So again, interestingly, contesting a will, and that's what most people hear about, can be done either on the validity of the will or I haven't been provided enough under the will, so I'm going to challenge the will, right? But if the assets don't go through the will, then challenging the will doesn't mean anything. And so if we do a lot of this restructuring as part of an estate planning process, it's usually not able to be undone by someone who has a problem with it later. In New South Wales, they can undo things, but in Victoria, we're pretty lucky that there's not really clawback provisions and things like that. So then you're looking at if someone is still a beneficiary of a trust, whether they have any entitlement to, under trust law, to jump up and down what's happened. But most of the time, if it's a family discretionary trust, there is actually no entitlement for any specific beneficiary. It's all at the discretion of a trustee. And so there's nothing that someone can do. If someone ends up as a minority shareholder in a business and the directors aren't doing what's in the best interest of shareholders, that's a separate action again to protect a minority shareholder. But it's still not a challenge to the succession plan itself. So I guess for people who have a family business, the more that you can do in terms of assets and structures that aren't on your will, the better, because what you do during your life can generally not be challenged through an estate will sort of process. So it gives you a little bit more comfort that if you do it right during your life, it's set.
And that's such an important tip, if you do it right in your life. I've heard people who specialize in business exit planning, not just for family business, saying when you start the business, you should have your exit plan and structure it in a way that takes that into account. Jacqui, have you done that with TBI? No, you don't have to answer that.
So, I mean, yes, to a degree. But the thing is, and I do tell people that your structure can change over time.
Yes.
Because, I could have started this business as a sole trader. And a lot of people start a business as a sole trader because it's tax effective when it's smaller. At a certain point of revenue, you change your business structure to a company, and then again, it's more tax effective at that point. And then, again, as I've done, you change your structure so that I've got a unit trust under my operating company. And so I can have people buy into the unit trust. And so I think it's a little bit of a fallacy that when you start a business, you should know how to exit. I think that you should start a business with the view to there having to be an end at some point, of course, but you can't have it fixed in your mind about how you're going to exit that. Like you might have 3 or 5 ways that you could exit, and you try and make sure that your structure over time will allow for that. But I mean, I also think, and I often have this conversation with people doing estate planning at different parts of their life, like at this time in your life, your main priority is actually not succession. Your main priority is tax effectiveness. And so if we keep that in mind, we do the succession planning the best we can, keeping in mind that tax is your main priority. But then once they're in their 60s, succession planning should be their main priority and tax less so. And so we can restructure things. And so again, you at the point in life where you are, or the point that the business is in, you do actually have to think, well, what is the primary objective here? And again, thinking about the team that is working with you through your business. Accountants tend to only look at tax. Lawyers tend to only look at legal stuff. But it's good to work with a team of professionals who will talk about this and actually work out, well, what is the primary objective for our clients, and work to that, rather than saying my area is most important. So we need to work to that.
And I think what's important that you've come up with there is as well, we've got to always check in. So what's right for whether it's a family business or business generally today, next year might be different, not just in relation to where I'm at, but where the market's at, where other, what's happening around the world, and in the family business, what's happening in my family, because dynamics change. Now, anonymous attendee, I'm wondering if it's the same anonymous attendee has asked us a question. How would you deal with a situation where there are a few key managers in a business that are key to the future when planning family succession? And I'm assuming those people are not in the family. They're just good employees and managers.
I mean, when you're thinking about business succession, I know we're talking primarily around family businesses because we're also making an assumption that there's some family members in the business working in there. But as we've said before, like if you try out one of your kids as a manager and they're not great, so the succession then might end up being, well, the kids own the business, but we have key managers in the business. Then it does depend on having those discussions with the kids, potentially having really good contracts in place for those managers, because the managers are still employees, and making sure that they understand what their role is, and everyone understands that that manager will be consistent throughout this process. And it's not to say either that the succession plan doesn't include some kind of partial sale to non-family members. Because again, thinking about business succession, most businesses, in fact, aren't succeeded by family members. There's more businesses that have some kind of employee succession than family succession. And so absolutely having really key important people in the business as part of that process, and even having them at the table potentially for these discussions, is not a bad idea at all, because they will also have an objective look at the business that doesn't have the family dynamics sort of overlaying too. So I don't know, is that useful?
I think that's very useful. I think because we sometimes forget succession planning could well be the answer. Succession planning could well be not the family, but what do I do with the business, and do we keep key employees? And if I'm selling the business, what is the role of key employees and managers for and even shareholders for the value of the business? What does it mean in the value? Because what we're really looking at, if we're looking at succession plans, also value, both monetary and to the family dynamic. And I suppose then we get into family business, and we talk about the Maya family structure, where none of the family in the business, but generations have gone by, and they still getting benefit from a business run by people completely different. But I think that brings us back. I keep throwing in our mediation because I know that we have that as our topic, is, well, that could even help with a mediator speaking to employees, who's this independent person, and say, look, this isn't going to go back to anyone, but what do you think? What about the dynamics in the business? What do you think about X as a manager? How are you managing under them? Now, you might not get a perfect answer, but they're more likely to speak to an independent person, and you get a better understanding of the dynamics within the business about how key employees feel about the family, and certainly the young'uns coming up through there. Yeah,
that's right. And the decision, or the who is being tapped on the shoulder to be, and how the key managers actually think that's going to go, can be some really good feedback that they might not be able to give to mum or dad boss directly. Yes, but now that we're sort of back on the alternative approach with mediation as well, I just wanted to touch on collaborative practice too.
Let's go for it, because you're one of the key experts on collaborative practice. So let's talk about that. Yeah.
So many people may or may not know, collaborative practice has been around a little while for family law only. And it's a process of, it's similar to mediation, but it's not. You've got a team of professionals, and it happens over a course of quite a few meetings instead of one. So, same, but different. A couple of years ago, they've opened up collaborative practice to estates as well. So estate disputes, but also succession planning. And so there are certain practitioners in each state who've been trained to be collaborative practitioners, just like with a mediator who has special training to be a mediator. It's not just someone who says, oh, I can mediate this for you. A collaborative practitioner is someone who's actually been trained, and not just a lawyer who says, yeah, I can work collaboratively. And so you can see we've been talking a bit about mediation and how key that mediator is to be independent and going and talking to all these other parties. So it could be quite complex and happen over quite a period of time. But then you don't necessarily have a earmarked professional who's been involved in those conversations who ends up doing the doing.
Right.
But with collaborative practice, there is often a solicitor for mum and dad, a solicitor maybe for the kids in the family business, maybe a solicitor for the kids who aren't in the family business. Then you have an independent financial person who's actually able to give financial advice to a group of people. And then you have a mediator or a conflict coach who is actually involved as well. So you have a team of professionals who are actually involved in the conversation, and the professionals will talk, and the parties will each talk to the communication coach or mediator and talk to the financial person, and they'll have their lawyer as well. And so you do actually then have a professional who's involved in the conversations who can then do certain parts along the way, because a mediator, if it's such a complex conversation, would then have to be potentially outsourcing some bits and pieces, or going to a person and saying, okay, so we understand this is going to happen. You have to go and engage your solicitor to do that, and then come back and tell me how it's gone. But that professional has not spoken to the mediator or has not sort of been part of the discussions. So unfortunately, sometimes in that situation, a professional who's otherwise engaged could go, oh, well, I actually know better, because they haven't been involved in the conversation, and they throw in a spanner in the woodwork. Or I think I've muddled my sayings. But
well, I like a spanner in the woodwork. It would do a lot more damage. I think what's important when we're talking collaborative practice is that the parties involved are not what I call the aggressive lawyer combat artist. So people who engage in collaborative practice are actually, although they're acting for the best interest of the client, they're not going in to smash the other side over their head with a blunt instrument. It's which we want them to do in court, but in collaborative practice, actually, how do we get the parties to move forward in a way that doesn't burn any bridges?
yeah, that's right. And the lawyers are actually there to give legal advice to their client and potentially keep their client in line, rather than having a go at the others. Absolutely. And the other thing about the collaborative team is that if you bring this team together to do this work, the professionals actually sign an agreement to say that they're not allowed to act for you if this process doesn't work. So they cannot be a litigator for you. So they're actually wholly in the process and want it to succeed, because they've got no other option to work for you otherwise.
That's the law we love, right, Jacqui? You and I love that kind of law. It's saying we're going to work together to build the bridges, to get the relationship going, even in the most murky of waters. And you don't have the client thinking, they're just trying to get us fighting so that they're going to make more money when we go to court. It's a real feeling that everybody's in there to preserve a relationship. And in family business disputes, it's most probably the best way to go if possible. And we don't have to, collaborative practice, I know we're talking about estates and planning, but succession planning for family business might not be completely about someone dying. And so we could use collaborative practice in any area of the law. It's not just confined to this. I'm just plugging that. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it can be opened up more and more to even like employee-employer situations as well. So
that's excellent. I'm going to ask. I'm going to remind people we can keep talking to each other for hours. But if there's any question you ever wanted to ask about wills and estates, and anything else, and about family business, please feel free to open the questions. Otherwise, I'm going to end with one last question for Jacqui, and that's, I'm going to give you a scenario, and I'll try and keep it simple. But let's say we've got a young mum and dad who've started a business. People, they're too scared. Like, it's what happens when she talks about death? What happens if she talks about divorce? And that's something we haven't gone into. Talk me through the trajectory of the discussion that we might have with the young couple starting out as a family business, and then, when the children are born, the concept of divorce in discussing family business. And then, of course, we've dealt with I call the final part of succession planning already. But take them through that trajectory. Firstly, when should they start talking about it? Why they shouldn't be scared about it? Or how do we make them not scared about it and take their head out of the sand?
I unfortunately think that people are going to be scared about it until they have their first consult.
Right.
I think that people either think that they need all the answers before they have their first consult, that some of the questions are going to be too big for them. And so because they don't have an answer yet, they don't want to make that first consult. So I think that those are some of the things stopping someone, the fear around what's going to be discussed. And yeah, some people don't like thinking about the end. And then there's some superstition as well. Some people really think that if we talk about this, it means it's going to happen.
Right.
Unfortunately, it's going to happen for everyone. It's 100% likely for everyone. There's no one that gets out of it. It's just a matter of time. And we don't want, the messy ones are always when there's not actual proper work done, and you have to deal with a mess. So young mum and dad come to me because their accountant has finally convinced them, after telling them for 3 or 4 years in a row, you're in business now, your kids are in primary school, you need to have a will. And so they finally make the appointment, and they don't really know what to bring to me. And I don't actually mind that, because I know what questions to ask and how to guide people through the process. And I will do it fairly bluntly, because they do have to think about the worst case scenarios. And so I say to them, you both pass away, who's looking after your kids? Who's looking after the money for your kids? What happens if your kids die as well? What happens if you have an accident, one of you dies and the other's in hospital for 6 months? How do you keep this business running if one of you has a serious head injury? So I ask the scenarios, ask the questions in that sort of way. And hopefully, because I do it fairly bluntly, they're not actually offended by it. I don't find that many people are. And they're just like, oh, gee, I haven't really thought about that. And I'm not necessarily asking them to answer the question straight away, but it's surprising how many people after an hour can actually get the majority of things down as to, okay, well, who are the key people in their life that I trust? So these people I trust about my kids, but these people have no idea about my business. So who could keep my business running? And sometimes it is actually the accountant or a professional that you have engaged, and you just have to have that person get the business through to be able to be sold, or to be able to appoint a manager to keep running it. So someone who can actually come in and get that done. And we just talk them through the things one at a time. And if they can't make some decisions, we make another appointment for 2 weeks' time, and I do the first bit of work, and I say, these are still the decisions you have to make, and get me this information from your accountant. And we have a booked appointment for 2 weeks' time, which gives them a time frame where they actually have to have had some discussions and thought about it, because we come back together after 2 weeks and we're like, okay, fill in the gaps. This is what has to happen. And now I've seen your family trust deed. We need to talk to the accountant about this. We need to tweak this bit. And so it happens if people are willing to give themselves over to the process.
And I guess that's the important part we try and emphasize is, as you say, it's inevitable as much as we might not want to talk about it. But as someone said, you can either go out in the coffin box or with a paper box. That means you leave your business walking out with head held high, and you know that you've got the value you need out of it, and that it's ready for the either dynasty or it's ready to be sold, and there's a value to it.
Yeah.
And so what we say is if we leave the too hard basket too long, it becomes even harder. So sometimes starting with a young family, we already know which child should not be running the business from the moment they start causing problems. Am I being a bit facetious there? Right. So I think that wraps it up, unless there are no more questions. Jacqui, where can people find you for your expert advice on wills and estate?
Yeah, so TBA Law, and I've sort of got it
Mm.
behind me.
Mm. There you go. Oh, look at that. You can phone. And we're gonna send out a PowerPoint so you will get Jacqui's details. And this is me, Elise Margot of Confidentially Speaking. You can find out at us at info@confidentiallyspeaking.com.au, or you can go to our website at www.confidentiallyspeaking.com.au. And we look forward to hearing you. Our next conversation will be in May, and we're going to be talking about thinking fast and slow in negotiation. For those of you who know about Daniel Kahneman and his book, yes, the discussion will be about what we learn in negotiation from that, and our speaker will be Simon Russell. We're just finalizing the date, so it should be a lot of fun, but look forward to continuing the conversation with you, and have a good Thursday afternoon.
Thank you.